Hello. With age, I reached a point where, while teaching objectivity for interpretation to students, of course, I like now to think more and more that subjectivity is all the signature that now it's needed. So what if you can't explain why? So what if you don't need to? Of course you could. Everything is justifiable, even the best as well as the worst taste. You can make the text tell what you think it says. You can find ways to use the interpretational translation, which is exactly what interpretation is, to match your ideology or your conviction. And then if you don't have any musical, intuitive, you start having one that is learned, taught, justified by logic and by facts. Somebody said that medicine is an art form at the crossroads of many sciences. I find in a way that there is a lot of science in the grammar of music, but it doesn't explain. It characterizes, but it doesn't explain its beauty, its touching, emotional, meaningful connection to us. Perhaps a fresh glass of water has the same effect as an andante with legato. Perhaps one can find so many analogies with the senses, the taste, the touch, the sight, and of course, through the hearing for music. I think so much is triggered in the psyche. But in fact, when you become mostly objective and you go through the written text, it's not through the ear, it's really through the eyes, and therefore finding a way, a path through the brain. I mean, oh, this sounds very artificial when said so. So you end up thinking, as a teacher, what's worth explaining the piece to the student or justifying an interpretational choice, as if one is accused to have just loved it the way it is. And it's not because you explain it that you feel it better or you transmit it better in your performance. Erudition is important. It gives you background, history. Analytical interpretation is very useful because it gives you deep connection with the text, as if you're in dialogue, really dialogue, not an imaginary monologue. Perhaps it's an imaginary dialogue, in fact, with the composer's thought process. Why did you do this there and not in the other spot? If I detect a pattern, why can't I detect it elsewhere? And why is it unplayable? Because you imagined something beyond or through the instrument that is orchestral, choral, or any kind of creative combination of art forms. And the composers, don't have to justify themselves. We have to play them. And in my case, I'm the hyphen. I have to teach them. I'm sort of the middleman. between the composer and the performer. Sometimes I like to make the analogy that it's more exciting giving the example and saying, oh, it's not an exciting piece, as if you sell in a showroom a sports car. And then I become the teacher. Finger phrasing, articulation, direction of the line, pedaling, breathing, harmonic progression, rhythmic articulation, sub-phrasing. And then at the end, you feel like you're teaching as if you're, in an analogy again, an insurance agent who sells you the car's insurance policy and who advises you to drive safely, or at least, in order to do so, carefully, cautiously. Whenever the argumentation of the salesman of the sports car is the speed, the curves, the way the car penetrates in the air, and you feel like he talks to your senses. Whenever the insurance salesman talks to your mind and tells you to be wise and careful, which is very important to be both, obviously. You don't buy an insurance policy to play bumper cars. It's for fun and nobody's hurt. You buy an insurance policy so you don't get hurt and you don't hurt others. So in a way, fingerings, articulation, combinations with the right fingering for the right phrasing that you think should be, at least even if it is on the scores edition, or you can argue that. But yeah, this is more of the practical element, which I think is very meaningful because students need to play with the piece on different pianos, experience the total discomfort of playing always on a different instrument, but trying to reach always the tiny detail that justifies the whole, the subtle sound painting. And the soundscape becomes revealing itself differently on every acoustics, but let less on the way you touch the keyboard, if you feel it's heavy or light or uneven or rambunctious. So how can I teach a student to be confident on any keyboard in any situation? Well, I can't. But in some situations and on some degree of keyboard non-response, I have technique. It's like winter tires for the driving analogy compared to summer tires. So gripping fingers or sliding fingers. So the fingerings depend, of course, of the topology of the of the terrain, which are the combinations of the white and black keys according to the tonality that the composer chose. And you always hear the student rightfully say, oh, it's easier the second time in this key than the first time. I know. I've been through it too. I've been a student in this piece too. Well, we all remain students, but then I think, okay, that's what I need to do, is find the disposition, redisposing the disposition, redefining if the two hands are close enough, compared to the notation, which is not always the reflection of the interpretation of a given composer's publishing company. It could be the intention of the composer in the first place, or it could be just the intention of the engraver of the score. But ultimately, is the morphology of the pianist's hands, width, stretch, length of fingers, independence of fingers' capacity through the exercises that I also provide. And then finally, we reach the point where my fingerings might, and I try my best, to adapt to each individual student's situation, physical, God-given, for the same spot, in the same place, played on the same size keys of all the pianos, but with different weight. for each finger to manage. So it becomes very challenging for them, and if they can have a fingering that sort of feels like an like fitting in their hand, so to say, sculpting the texture or the sculpting the keyboard in order, of course, through the action, you don't touch directly the strings like in other instruments, but still on the piano you feel that there is some kind of ergonomic fingering, as I like to think it is, that gives you pleasure to touch it as well and play it, as well as gives you some confidence that you're not going to slip out of it. The black keys are separated by large spaces. You cannot really play the next door note. Whenever the white key is being aligned, you can easily land on the note next to it or touch the note next to the note that you're supposed to shift to, reach, jump into, or prepare, depending on what the score says. Tempo, phrasing, and direction, and of course the choice of the composer's patterns. It becomes very meaningful to me because I was young, and in my case, no matter how incredibly inspirational and high-spirited my teachers were, their pedagogy was based on let him fight until he finds it out by himself. That is the true pedagogical test. You don't give the answer, or you don't give a solution. You give a way to build your own lock and then forge your own key, and then you find how to do it. In other words, it's based on very long-term development and patience until the wisdom of the player compared to his or her intuitive, or call it talent, or drive, musical meaning matches the performing of it. And therefore you feel like they're like bats with another analogy again, pops up always up to me, all these analogies. A bat with a defective antenna or not yet trained antenna and hits in the wall. Well, the more you hit, the more you avoid. And this empirical way to learn is something that my generation teachers did very well. They considered that giving you a hint of a solution was already pedagogically wrong. First of all, it makes you lazy, full of yourself. That's what they thought for the student. But I still think that there is ways to combine both. You can give, and I do my best for that. Give them a rule how to organize yourself according to similar sections in other pieces in the disposition of the keyboard for the fingering choices. Of course, you have to find patterns, chordal, arpeggiated, or flexible thumb, knuckles, straight fingers to play together, notes that are played together, soft or loud. But there's so many layers in a piece. It's not like you just learn the bassoon on the viola part. You have to play all of the parts, and you have to layer them and color them and follow them and anticipate them mentally in order to display them through your fingers' differentiated weight to the tip of the cushion of the finger that touches the key, and then expect that the action will relate this to the hammer hitting the string, and then the capacity of the instrument's resonance, which will guide, and you follow then the hopefully delayed decay of the long sound, if it is, in order to imitate. In denial, it's a singing instrument when it's percussive, but with resonance and pitches and vibrations through the pedal that enhances the waves of the vibrations. So put all together, it's a very important balance to find between let the student figure it out to a point to which they can solution it, or then you have the problem of the short-term everything. In a one-to-one, alone on an island way of thinking, open-ended studies, you can take your time to let the music, the texture, the technique to appreciate it, but also to approach it, therefore. Let it macerate. Let it filter inside you. And let it hit your pianistic... it's just difficult to do when you're young, obviously. A pianistic maturity, which comes from experience about how to organize the legato if it's to be with other voices going on in the same hand, how to manage substitution fingerings, which are in fact for most of the students today very disrupting, in fact, from their concentration, since most good pianos can play legato with pedal and five. If you're playing the melody with the pinkies, most of the time it's on the top of the right hand or the fourth finger, and lack of independence between the two since they share a tendon. So you practice exercises for their independence, but then you have to apply them in the performance, and then it still remains a weaker point in your hand than first and second fingers, since thumb and two are the grabbing fingers of our species. So inevitably they are more comfortable, but the composers don't always write, and far from most. Most of the time they don't write with the pianistic hand in mind of the human. They write voice leading, they write polyphony, they write chordal stretches, because some of them who play like Rachmaninoff could. And we couldn't, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't play their pieces just because we don't have their stretch. And to the contrary, finding ways of translating on a piano music for a harpsichord, which often is with lesser stretches given the range of the instrument and the width of the keys, and the very genre style, writing, expression. In fact, the idiom is completely different. And so in a translation on the piano, then the fingerings change also. The usage of the thumb, the lack of usage of substitutions in order to connect without pedal, and therefore keep the pristine quality of the melodic connection without too much overlapping and without harmonic blur. Since the harmony and the melody are played with the same foot pedal, the right foot on the piano, you have to be careful how to breathe the pedal, how to put it quarter or half or none. If you can finger pedal all the voices in order to play given texture with clarity. Now, the clarity is idealized even. Sometimes composers themselves counted on certain grit from the combination of sounds that interact together, not in clarity, but in some kind of shadow and light. Therefore, the voicing helps a lot, because then one voice can shadow the other, which is the bring out light by the intensity of the sound, which on the piano can be achieved with a dynamic range. The harpsichord contrast, harpsichord by the articulation, delay, resolutions, and different types of phrasings. So it's different ways of decorating the expression, defining the expressivity, enunciating with expression, which literally is the opposite of impression. Therefore, you bring out something, and therefore you have to be eloquent and persuasive and expressive, even if you're in a dying death, a breath of death, sorry, or in the excitement of a build-up towards a huge and build-up of emotional, psychological, physical, so to say, physiological at least, completely connected, vibrating as a membrane to the piece when you reach Rachmaninoff piece's climax. it truly is the translation of the word's meaning through the senses, through the sounds that talk about touches, warmth, or about the how can I say that more clearly? At the same time, it's so difficult to find words. It's more like a hug. Well, there you go. That's a word. But doesn't come naturally to mind to a musicologist, right? For a description of climax in Rachmaninoff piano piece. But in fact, it is. Regardless how we describe it, or how we receive it, or how we feel it, nothing but in our fingers playing it. And through our fingers, the sound combinations, the harmonic combinations, the melodic drive, all these are analogies for human feelings. Delay, expectation, angst, desire, build-up of emotion, release of this emotion, and then the atmospheric decay after it, and the regret, and the sense of abandon that it can be reached. All these words are words. They describe, they analogize, they bring us to a certain way of thinking the piece before we start playing, and while we play it, we feel it. So I would say that the analytical interpretation is more when you can stop and start, write down, and try sections in different options of interpretational voicing. I'll bring out this, I'll bring out that, the middle, the low, the top voice, or a combination thereof, according of what I consider is meaningful. And that's why it goes back to my initial thought about subjectivity and objectivity. Too much objectivity, too much editions, too much articles, too much musicologists defining the artwork that I transmit to young students. And in a way, while we need their input to be perhaps for the students and the teacher equally, well, I don't separate them all so much with the musicologists, but sometimes these scholars become sort of like the grand priests of the of the musical understanding or knowledge, or defining the musical language of a composer and of a piece, and of the right tempo, and how to count, and how to subdivide the beat if it's in this rhythmic pattern with this metric indication on the meter at the entrance, and then at the beginning of each line, and then how to display the real notes compared to the decorative and melodic notes, which are embellishments or delaying the beautiful note that you value it by not playing it right away, the appoggiaturas, the cacciaturas. Of course, as a performer, you don't choose any of it. It's already done by the composer through the publisher, and then the display of the hands and how and which. It doesn't. Sometimes the publisher gives fingerings, but fingerings are so personal. It's not like gloves where they say one size fits all. It's very personal, according to the capacity of the flexibility of the fingers, of attraction of the thumb, the straightness between the knuckle and the tips. But it's nothing but the translation of what musically you hear when you read the music. Even if you don't analyze it, you go, oh my God, this melody is so beautiful. Oh, and these bass lines, they just fall like, you know, honey in my shoulders, and I feel like my soul is covered. I can imagine all kinds of things. I'm just saying that of the spontaneity as usual of my thoughts. But generally, even if silly, these passing thoughts, which are reflective of the sensual emotion that a piece of music can bring to you, let less when you play it, even if only as a listener, combined with the action of playing, where you have to remain in of course, intuitively driven with the piece, emotionally attuned to it in order to translate it, but as well as technically completely objective in that case, by the fingerings that allow you to be reliable in any case, any acoustics or instruments, but also emotional state. When students translate everything through "I'm nervous," they are disappointed to disappoint themselves for all their practicing hours if they mess it up in public. Or the one time through in public is not just the run through of the sections that they practiced as if an obstacle course to go through, which at the end going through it feels to them because the piece has such levels of depth, dimensions, scope that it englobes things that you cannot in constant time, in real time, constantly display. It has a phrase that is overlapping everything. And then you have articulations of shorter phrases inside. So you have to have this clear enunciation within the musical character if it has some kind of shadow and lights as well. And so the technique is there to make you reliable so that you don't fear, which is what students fear in public performance. The unexpected happens, either where you've always practiced with trouble and you fear that you might make it wrong, or because you're not focused, concentrated enough when people listen to you, or bothered by this lack of intimacy. It's literally an invasion of privacy to go on stage for some of them. More, and some others as well, but some manage it to think of it for the stage fright by evacuating the presence of the listeners or their captured attentive listening, breath holding, which gives the silence some of their held breaths, an intensity that is difficultly bearable of the attention that is brought to them on stage, and they feel like they can only fail, and the attention expectation of the audience and their own practicing and the composer's piece that they love to serve, for which they started to play in the first place. And this can be months, weeks, years of the knowledge of a piece. Of course, the more you perform it, the more you don't lose that fear of disappointment of yourself or for the piece that you place so high in your admiration, that if you are going to be a theater actor, you don't want to stutter or invert the meaning nervous stutter, I meant, or invert the syllables of a word just because you're too nervous and all of a sudden your brain, fails you. And if you are overly perfectionist, and it's just necessarily something the teacher should encourage, and I do, then the student locks in all these intuitive musical drive for which in the first place they do music playing on the piano. Is in order to secure the transmission on stage, they lock in all the all the taps so that they control the most of everything. But in fact, then nothing comes out with the tap. So in a way, yes, it doesn't mean that to play musical, expressive, intuitive, emotional, heartbreakingly driven, the jubilation as well as the sadness of the piece, fully immersed in it for the audience through your playing, that it means that you don't control in order to play it musical, and then if you control it technically, then it's not musical. I think it is and, not or. Always musical and clean, as they like to say it. We like to say it, even if I think the dictatorship of the wrong note kills that intuition, in that intensity, that spontaneity, which is in the first place what drives you to answer to the piece that you received through a score from some who knows when composed piece in another time period where people had different ways of thinking of all the things that are emotionally described in it. Love, expectation, tiredness, anger, jubilation. It's a musical translation of humanity, of their humanity, of their time period in ours. But universally, it is human nature, and humans are humans, and that's what they are. And they were, and they will be, even if coded in technological civilization today, or that wants us to be more that, or in lesser so and differently soaked in different thinking, priorities in life, in preceding civilizations or in preceding ways of thinking, reacting to all this, life expectation, length, many things in account, to take in account. And I do, as a performer. But as I say, when I teach, I want to be giving them all the benefit of my experience for the technical aspect of things, But then, if I give an example, inevitably it is subjective, it's no more objective. I can justify it by saying, yeah, they repeat second times different, or bring out this voice, or I don't like that. I like it to become theirs, their choice. Something has to be theirs. You cannot, and you shouldn't spoon feed them the interpretation, spoon feed them the understanding of the context and the texture, spoon feed them everything. You can't, shouldn't. It's possible, depending if there is a docility in the student and some kind of overfull ego in the teacher, which is not rare. But factually, teachers can be as insecure as students at different levels, because in a way we remain very much children in front of the score, even if we've lived for it compared to them for decades, and they start their journey with a piece. And they'll go through their own rediscoveries, rejections, rediscoveries of the piece through the times in their own musical life. That's so moving to me when I see them on the sunrise of their connection with the piece. When I am at the sunset and they are at the sunrise, it's almost like we touch each other's emotional connection to the piece psychologically in the transmission. It's still the sunlight, even if one is sunset and one is sunrise. And in between there was a path. Jubilant, emotional, driven, exciting, excited, disappointed, regretful life. It's a companionship to play through one's life, a piece that has evolved while in a way it stays the same. And so I've tried my best to avoid the trap, I consider a teacher's trap, to compare the student's approach to my approach of the piece when I discovered it at their age, if it were. Because they're not me and I am not them, and I'm not teaching myself. I teach them. And if it means differently to them in their first visitation of the piece, through my help, which they seek from me, I try to adapt to what it means to them. I don't try to sway them 100% to my way of liking it, because I feel like they can perhaps accept it depending on their individual character and the inevitable asymmetrical situation between a teacher who's supposed to be the knowledge and the student who's supposed to be not. And therefore you empty one recipient to fill up another recipient. That doesn't work that way. But I still think that it's very enriching and very humbling for the teacher who has been with a piece for longer than the student by essence, to realize that he or she might have been not seeing this aspect that the student sees intuitively and that escaped to me when I was seeing it. It's not 100% each of those things. It's perhaps in part a section here, a way of doing a ritenuto, a rubato, bringing out this, not bringing out that. They are not a raw material, the students, that you're supposed to shape like as if you're playing with Play-Doh. That's not at all that. That's very respectful. I respect their personalities. I respect their contradictions. I respect their intuitive contradictions with me. I try to sway them by persuasion of tradition, style, context of the piece, and then a certain way I was taught in the tradition of performing it. So between the tradition of the composition and the tradition of the interpretation and the evolving tradition of these interpretations, which today they can find much easier than in my generation, which was very rare to have access to on recordings. In a way, they have more comparisons in mind. And less the score itself telling them what to do or dictating to them what to do with the phrasing, the ritenuto, or the rubato, or the whatever. I don't try to erase their intuition. I don't try to spoon-feed their love of the piece, because in a way, if they didn't love it in the first place, or it didn't mean to them enough to travel, I don't know how much, to study with me this piece, they know what this piece is. At least if we don't agree, we agree on the fact that it means a lot, even if differently, to them or to me. And I'm not there to bring them to my way of believing in the piece or to what it means to me. I should, in a way I do intuitively or subconsciously. I cannot completely dissociate myself from myself, the objective from the subjective from the objective. That's, after all, why I think with age I've reached the point where I think, yes, I can analyze, I can give rational fingerings to help the unexpected on stage and give them the capacity to express whatever it means to them through the tools of the technique that gives them some comfort zone. It's a strange word to say, comfort zone. It's never going to be comfortable, but perhaps a sense of reliability, and that gives them a sense of stage, I would say, confidence. It's so important to have confidence on stage, just because as soon as you start playing, you place yourself in the hands of the unknown. The piece transports you like Arabian rug, flying rug, and you fly high, and then you can crash in the middle of the fly because of the flight's problems with the technique. So you have to manage to control the technique to the point to which you can express your musicianship. And the paradox of practicing is that you end up in order to play well, clean, so to say, but it is the word. It's not a dirty word to say clean. It's interesting to say that. No pun intended. But really, it's incredible. It's all because of that. And then, in fact, once you have it, it locks you off from the musical expression by the time you control so much in order to avoid the unexpected. You have to deal with the unexpected, yes. And probably the good technique, which I hope through my fingerings and articulations and exercises for each section, how to reach this or that, gives you a sense, not that it's going to work out no matter what, because that would be irresponsible, but it gives you a chance to react in real time to the unexpected when it happens. And sometimes when students realize they make a mistake in performance where they've never made during practicing, and to the contrary, a section which almost gave them always trouble in practicing goes through the performance on the, like, miraculously well. They don't realize it, and then because they do subconsciously in a way, then they lose their concentration because they're sort of like driving ahead with the piece, playing on autopilot, analyzing in real time what just happened, if it was an accident or miraculous passing. And they have to keep ahead mentally in order to be able to organize their the synergy of their gestures, the muscular memory, the shiftings, the preparation, the anticipation, the distance, the everything. The brain is just a fascinating instrument. You play many voices or instrumental voices with a single brain instead of the conductor making sure that he or she can bring these many brains into a single flow of accepting to be together, not just aligned, superimposed, and synchronized together, but together in a direction towards the line of arrival points. And so it becomes a dynamic togetherness, a togetherness like the flock of birds that flies towards a point all at the same time, and in a ways that they help themselves from the winds by having the ones in the front break the wind, and the others are aligned in ways to follow in the groove and not to have to all face the wind. So this kind of things happen in the performance, and sometimes the performance turns out to be totally different of what you planned in your head. When you ephemerally constructed in your mind ahead of you, you projected ahead of you a blueprint of the piece as a construction, and then while you play it, the structures don't hold, or the repeat didn't work out, or the transition was too slow and you didn't merge in the new tempo of the second theme, but you have to catch it up, make it up, and you shouldn't have, could have, didn't. That you can always analyze when you stop and start, or when you rehearse, or when you practice, or when you record. But in the performance, it's all through. One time each section in the follow-up of the musical thought of the composer, given the form or the composer's desire to not follow a form. But we follow the composer's follow-up of notes. And we have to multiply the or divide rather one brain into many voices whenever the orchestra or the chamber groups they merge all their brains into one, and we divide ours into many. Do we really follow when we perform all the voices at the same time? Do we only privilege a few or one which is our guide, and then we follow it while we play? Is our hearing disturbing us? Sometimes on stage the fright comes from the fact that the listening is heightened because of the held breath of the listeners, as I like to say, as I just did say earlier, as well as that you are in an awareness of everything, more so the quality and the intensity, the pregnant silence or rests, the intensity of a secondary voice in contrapoint or in parallel interval with the melodic line, and things that you take for granted because repetitively you play through many times until a pair of hands that you should have almost for practicing inputs the brain's muscular memory, while you should have another pair of hands just for performing. If not, you get the tendinitis by the repetitivity it takes to input all this information into the brain in order to generate that so-called muscular memory that allows you to play certain things in a autopilot version while you control or guide or pilot forward the thoughts of the phrasing and the tempo and the leaning and the this and the that. I'm very thankful to having been given a chance to interact with students' experiences of these pieces. I think, have I not taught, I would have not understood how many ways, how many different ways the same section of a piece can mean to so many people. And not about the black or white, meaning unsubtle thinking of right or wrong. Preferably I am right and they are wrong, right? To a certain extent, at some point, you have to build up a sense of knowledge that you agree that this is your conviction, regardless how you got to it, analytically, intuitively, or combining both. And then you can evolve from it and say, oh, I don't like to play that slow movement as slow anymore. I lose myself in details. I want to give the direction of the line a meaning. That's what it is. It's like a foreign language. You listen to the music of the words because it's connected from the meaning of the words, which in the first place is the purpose of the language. But also the subjective beauty of the objective meaning. And so you connect the melodic words, sounds to their meaning, and you try to align and think, okay, onomatopoeias do that, obviously, when you imitate sounds of nature or of animals. But when you say concepts through syllables and then diphthongs and all this, and vowels and consonants, and throat and lips and teeth and breath and accents and ways of speaking a language from different points of view of a geographical positioning, you realize, like for language, that music also has that capacity to, it's a declination of different ways through different points of entrance into the piece. Psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, cerebrally, intuitively, or also by imitation of a model that you like, and you say, I would like to play like this or that. I'm very lucky and humbled to have been given a chance to teach pieces to people to whom these pieces mean so much. Perhaps differently much as to me, but much nevertheless. And so the old teacher and the young student face the same score, and we try to extract from it through our ears, eyes, soul, yearning for what it means and grabbing it and bringing it out. I would like to voice out this. I would like to bring out this. I would like to combine these two voices I grab out. I mean, it's almost like sculpting, literally, three-dimensional sound making. And of course, if you reach the point where the publishers make you understand that there is an authenticity, then you feel like, yes, but I like it better my way. And who am I? Nobody. Who is the publisher? The representative of the composer. Therefore, everything. And so then we have an objectivization, because I cannot say this word anymore. Objectivity is rather probably the way to say it. That is spread globally through a publisher. And people who learn the famous same ballade by Chopin, prelude by Rachmaninoff, etude by, I don't know, Liszt, or prelude and fugue by Bach, or toccata by whoever. The point is that besides the published edition, compared to the Baroque days where you had to copy as a student the piece in order to study it, because there were no published pieces to buy, let less money for it. And so in a way, the learning happened in the copying before the performing. And so it helped to know how to display the layers of the piece. Because in the first place, you basically wrote them. You didn't invent them, you copied them. And my teacher made me copy from memory as well, without keyboard, I mean. But the point is that you know it's not yours, hopefully. If not, then you're really in denial. But overly praising authenticity is also a problem, because what if the composer accepted and suggested and hoped that every performer will bring in something that means to them from the piece out? It's like a different way of displaying the light on the sculpture, or a different way of highlighting elements that mean to you, that are not individually essentially different, but the combination brings something that can be appealing to you that perhaps is not appealing to somebody else. It can be small things taken individually. A pulse, a phrasing, a direction, a breathing, a pedal, a rest, a tempo. Not a drastic difference of tempo, but tempo nonetheless, that gives you a sense of flow or a sense of reflection more than the flow, if it's evocative of a dance or of a song. All these things are what it takes until you understand that you're perhaps allowed to dialogue with the composer's thought process, as I said earlier, and then you interact so intensely because it means to you so much, because you love it, not because you're told or because you read, because you can. But when you do, it either goes in the direction of your liking of the piece and say, oh, I love this article because it corresponds to what I like in the piece, like what I liked in the book compared to what the film maker made out of it. And I don't like the fact that I don't find my favorite sections of the book in the film. Same thing here. You can say, oh, they don't know what they're doing, they don't hear the piece like it's supposed to be. I'll tell you how it's supposed to be. Perhaps certain of those elements are true. There are ways that things are supposed to be. That's typical teacher's words, right? But in fact, I think the interpretation is part of the composition. And the fact that Ravel or some composers openly, or Stravinsky, considered interpretation basically what it was in their eyes, a betrayal, is also because interpreters perhaps took too much freedom in the past, at least in their own time. And today perhaps the Ricardo Vignes of the times, or the Buzonis of the time, or the Liszts of the time, who didn't make interpretations. They literally tailored the piece to their own pianism, and they didn't consider it arrogant. Today, oh my God, it would be in the political correctness of the uni edition that goes through the world of publication, that makes through competitions and music schools worldwide some kind of a globalization of political correctness of the interpretation of famous pieces, and locks in the intuition, inventivity, creativity, drive, fresh approach of the students that are new to it and have to bring what it means to them, instead of being told, no, the pianissimo is second bar after 14 on the second beat and it cannot be on the third, and the a tempo comes only on the third quarter note and not on the second. And you start getting into the details of the notation, and who knows why. After all, it could be just, if not random, it wasn't as detailed, and sometimes it was. But most composers of the past, they had to survive. So they wrote quickly and they wrote ephemerally. And if it was published, they didn't always have back and forth check-ups and proofreading. In the case of Robert Schumann, Clara, who survived him almost his life length, since she was so younger when they got married, and he died young, tragically, with his mental state. Um, what a terrible thing it was. I feel so bad for him, and cruelty. There was cruelty of life for him. But anyway, she survived at least 4 decades, and she performed him so much. She made new editions or new publications, renewed, and probably they were tainted by her experience of the performing of the piece, because in a way that's when the piece really comes alive, where you know how it holds. Like you drive a car and you realize if the brakes hold well, or the aerodynamics really respond to this, or how you adjust the engine to the chassis and all these things. You can idealize them, you can imagine them in your drawing, or today computer model, but it is to be tested on the road. And she tested his works on the road. When he didn't, he composed them and died. And he couldn't play them himself to save his life. So inevitably, I think that the editions that she made of the pieces after having toured them around the world, literally, are the experience of the pieces being performed. I read in a book that Rachmaninoff, playing his Corelli variations in front of the audience in public, of course, would not play all of them if he feels like the audience doesn't connect. But of course, the audience didn't know the piece then. And so that's different when the performer is the composer, or when Clara is the closest to the composer but not the composer, and brings the piece to the audience, becomes the living membrane that vibrates the music so we can hear it, we can imagine it, we can establish it in our pantheon of beloved music. And you have your favorite composers, your favorite pieces, mostly because of your favorite performers. And if not, only through your analytical understanding of the score, less often also. And that can be connected and combined with lyrics for operas or arias or songs or art songs. And so all different forms of artistic expression, going from dance to philosophy of music, and combining it with the aesthetic of the sound itself. Because of the evolving instrument and the acoustics and the expectation, how can you bring an intimate pianissimo in front of 2,000 people, like in a huge airport lounge size hall, and hold that into the second escapement of the piano's action so that it can just speak as a whisper of intensity before, perhaps, or without intensity before, to exhale? So you have to recreate the intimacy of the expression of the piece in places where it's made to also project, and with acoustical resonance, very enhancing, so quality being, romantic era piano concerti where the orchestra and the pianists are roaring together, and it's exciting for the audience, and it's beautiful, it's enthusing, it's uplifting delight of the spirits. But who can the more, can the less. And the fact is that you have to be able to maintain the capacity to play these intimate sections as well, without to forcefully play them louder just because you play in front of a larger audience. So in a way, yes, the evolution of the acoustics, of the expectations with the recording engineering and the instruments compared to the pieces composed before such things were even thought of for recording engineering, let less for projecting into large halls. So the intimacy that was natural to a Chopin, let's say, improvisation in a salon in Paris and playing it into a big concert hall, where people already have in their ears the performances of the CDs nowadays, of the files that they download, of the recordings or the videos that they see. And so inevitably their expectation rises differently, and their capacity of concentration perhaps diminishes because they get so distracted by too many things. You see programs of concerts of the past that had 4 parts with 2 or 3 intermissions. Today people will say, oh my God, I'm afraid the audience would be bored if I take the repeat in the piece. Imagine. So the thirst for music, for expression, for being in music, there was no music outside of making music in the past. There is no electricity, there is no artificial light as today. So there was really night and there was really day, and there was really a rare opportunity to connect to a piece, and then it talked to our psyche and we became an unbelievable connection, like a beloved poem, a beloved piece of music, a beloved book, a beloved painting, and it creates your inner world, and you become, as a human being, carrier of beauties that former living humans left you, and that you discovered either by chance or sometimes by obligation, and most of the time, besides the famous ones that you have to know if you want to be cultivated, you discover the lesser known ones, and you start becoming their proponent, which is my case for Dupont, for instance. But all these things come as branches of a tree that develop on with your own experience, curiosity, expression of the music that you perceive is more than you're convinced might be. And it's not just going against what people think, it's doing what you think is what the score through your brain and soul brings you to do. And you think that's what you understand. So yes, I've studied a lot, but I felt a lot. And I believe very much in that objectivity is necessary to justify the general trends of what you're going to do in your interpretation of a piece. But then the subjectivity is what you bring to it. In the same tempo, with the same phrasing, with the same instrument, on the same dynamic range, with the same tone engineering, you have 2 pianists play and you don't hear the same piece. Is not striking? When I hear as a juror of competitions, international competitions, very skilled pianists playing the same pieces on the same instrument, one after the other, there is a sense of sameness because of the publications, of the scores, because of the instruments industrialization, because of a certain taste developed through recordings of and teaching of schools, so that people sort of tend to play the political correct international way, the worldly way. You have less weird people playing weirdly, you know. But within all this, you have such incredible differences of meaning, of sentence, of carrying the thought. This is what it is. Full circle, subjective prevails. Creative voicing, hinted or not by the composer, obviously not if there is no stamps holding that opinion, but it means to you as a performer, as it does to me, for instance, in the first prelude in F sharp minor by Rachmaninoff, so much. I'll have to do it. It becomes part of my loving the piece. Perhaps not forever, and perhaps forever. Who knows? Anyway, forever is every day is the last, every day is the first. But still, it plays inside yourself. It lives with you even when you don't play it. And when you play it, it just comes out, and then you look at it, you hear it, and you realize how, as if you see the flower blossomed after you had it seen just start its life. I believe that interpretations have also their seasons. Understanding of the pieces too, just like everything in life as well as civilizations, has a beginning, a peak, and a decay. And paradoxically, there's so much repertoires that people ignore today that were the peak of music making in the past. You know it by programs of the past, and you realize how come the pantheon of the famous great composers to play has been so different from ours today. Why some who today are considered lesser important composers, to say the least, forgotten to say the truth, are being so programmed a century or two ago, or even less, in the past. Is it just fashion? Is it saturation, and then people search for something different? Could be. In any case, that you play a piece that is very famous, or a piece that is no more famous or forgotten, and or play a piece that is just now composed, and you want to premiere it, or have to, or ask to, or have to, or could, these things. Regardless of the circumstances, I meant, put all your heart in it. Be subjective. Be subjective. Pour your heart into it. This is a bar where he didn't indicate, Rachmaninoff, a voicing of low stems for the low bass. Do, mi, re, la, si, fa, mi, do, fa. But I love to bring that out, perhaps in an imaginary interpretation of it. So that is typically subjective versus objective. So this is what's written for this first prelude in F sharp minor, opus 23. Of course, it's only a bridge of a dominant to a tonic to finish a very long phrase that comes from the long but progressively slow decay from the climax. So while the melody is in these long vowels, those long half notes, and then you have the eighth notes in contrary motion, which are with upper stems in the left hand, while the harmonization is offbeat. So he suggests that as a secondary voice top part, while the right hand is the melodic line of choice. The bar. Now I brought it out too much to demonstrate it. Now in the proportions with the melody, the accompaniment, the tempo, the decaying, and the expression. So does it mean that I am, if not allowed, because it's not written in the indication of the notation with the stem? I understand that this is how he notated it, or his publisher notated it. And perhaps he didn't want this to be intuitively, or perhaps in my case a bit creatively, brought. Perhaps it would distract too much from the melody in the right hand. There is ritenuto, diminuendo, and piano. That's the subjective in the objective, even if it's a detail. So in this case, he does show the exact voicing of the accompaniment secondary voice with the upper stems compared to the harmonic lower stems, and of course the melody on top that is in the larger values after the climax. So obviously in the fortissimo it meant to him enough to notate it or have it displayed, and not just orchestration. You could have 16 violins playing in vibrato intensity, these long values without decay. On the piano they do. So then you have time to hear in between the half notes this. That you don't even need the melody. So much food for the soul there is in this section, and you can sing it. These incredibly long phrases that are like incredible long sunsets. What can I say? Sergei, what do you say? Oh, you say a lot. You say so much. It's a scream, it's a cry, it's a flow, it's a phrase, it's a hug, it's it's almost as if it's a never-ending phrase. You don't want it to be dropping dynamically or in range, but it does. In very large values. And it's not easier to build up a crescendo, but musically and humanly, psychologically, it's easier to add. Of course, if you add too early, too much, you have to bang because you reached the dynamic ranges capacity of your playing or your instrument, but have to layer better continuously the crescendo. But it's harder to diminish with a continuous drop that is almost like the denivellation of the Roman times aqueducts to bring the water. And so that tiny denomination that doesn't visualize it look like it's dropping, but it is, to allow the water to flow. And I find that so beautiful when you manage to control both the build-up and both the descent after the decay of the sound after the climax. famous Rachmaninoff climax. And everything that comes out of it is stardust. Not too early down. It's too early soft. Now you can only go softer than that. And softer still. It's not so softer, it's so far more distant. It's close and distant. Typical Rachmaninoff, he could play FCFA, which is way too stretched for most, if not any, pianist. But you have 4 Fs, therefore the most, and then you have 2 As for the third, and 2 Cs for the fifth of the triad, minor triad of F sharp minor. So the right hand plays 1, 2, 3, 5, and the left hand 5, 3, 2. But that's impossible. I mean, at least for me, for sure. So what do you have as a choice? To arpeggiate it? Sorry, that's not the right note. Or like a guitar or a harp. Cannot take it in the other hand because it's not close enough, and it looks like sneezing. Silly Emile, but I still think that okay, if we have 1, 2, 3, 4 F sharps, the root, we have 2 C sharps of the fifth, and 2 A's of the third. So if we play, we have the first perfect balance, 2 F, 2 C's, 2 A. Of course, we could have the 4 or 3, 4 F's. There's no way, right, if you take off a note, it means 1 F less, so you have 3 instead of 4, but you have 2 C's and 2 A's. I don't think he counted it like that. He played it because he could. And the beauty of the display of the 10th resonates better than the resonance of the third in the low register compared to in his. Don't want to sing it in the concert, that less. Perhaps the nose can play one, I don't know, I can't. But that's typical Rachmaninoff. He writes for his own hand, not for mine or yours. And if yours is luckily stretched with long fingers like his, you could play that ending as written, as notated, without arpeggiation or suggestion to. It was assumed that those who will play with lesser big hands, they'll do some kind of dislocation or perhaps a harp in the left hand and in the right hand plucked. Okay, that is customization. It's not so much subjective compared to objective. Actually, it's the only way you can. Whenever the voicing of this bar, I remain to believe that some of them are suggested and some of them without the stems are left to the composer or to the performer rather. for that, you would say, right? It's a passing bar that doesn't have a climatic meaning like the famous. So it's not glamorous. So who cares? Of course, if we care, but I mean, does it mean so much that we have to spend so much time thinking of this creative baseline? But he shaped it, he wrote it, he chose it. La note choisie, the chosen note. I don't know what sounds in Russian. And then every first 16th of the top stem creates a scale, but they're in 16th notes, not in 8th notes. If they were, then it will be plus the offbeat note. And perhaps it's in these details that lays the emotional, undetected in the listening flow of events, reason for which we feel so moved. I think every detail has its meaning. Perhaps in this case overly so, but still you have to allow yourself to live it. It has to be something intuitive, emotional. It is a response to the book, but also a response to what the book notes mean to us. Might be only a detail, but it's worth spending one's life over. Well, figuratively speaking, because there's so many details. And the whole is the point, but the details are the nutrition. And then you feel like since the beginning of the piece, here he does show that he wants the left hand alone to have, if you see, all the voices, the bottom stems, the top stems, plus the voicing and the phrasing and the hairpin, plus the grace notes unmeasured to start the piece, almost like a harp or a guitar. And then the melody only comes in large values on the top after. So therefore, if the melody was not even existing, as I like to think, the piece is beautiful by itself from the left-hand point of view, played with two hands, which is not enough, almost. Inevitably, he indicates it here and not the last time. Is it the publisher? Is it him? Is it that he wanted it to be here? When you modulate to a relative major, and then he has it compared to the bar I showed you at the end. At the end, the same, returning to F sharp minor, he doesn't have it. So does it mean that he purposely didn't check, didn't proof check, or did the publisher choose that in F sharp minor return is less meaningful than bridging into a major? I would imagine. See how I try to add logic to the intuition of mine compared to the reading of the score. So we constantly playing, so to say, playing obviously, not the right verb, but balancing the act between intuition and understanding, analytical and emotional, spontaneous and thought. And all this left hand with complexity of 16th notes, might it be with their own secondary stem plus the bottom part. It's almost 3 parts in one hand, and both 3 or 2 of them, if they play them like thirds or like individual, are pianissimo under the melody in decaying long values. So in a way, the over-rich texture, complexity, polyphony, emotional polyphony of the accompaniment, that's a good one. It's satisfactory for us musically, and then on top of it, I feel like we need a singer here. And I'm accompanying a singer in an art song. Dialogue, no more an aria between. And he builds up towards that explosive moment of the emotional burst that is the fortissimo climax. Write in the edition, at least, or the publisher doesn't indicate different dynamics for the left hand compared to the right hand when you reach the climax. You have it different with pianissimo for the left hand at the get-go, and then the melody is written at the start, mezzo forte, before it builds up to more. I don't know if you see it. But it does start with pianissimo, so it sets up the background, and then the melody is for mezzo forte. And when you go to the you get to the famous climax 2 pages later, from pianissimo, mezzo forte. At the climax point, it's all fortissimo, all for all. Obviously, this cannot be, has to be layered. Mezzo forte, mezzo piano, plus the grace note, plus the pedal, the harp or the whatever. And then here, fortissimo, without decaying the sounds, but you cannot play them tremolo. It's not like violins, but you see how the melodic line is so overflowing over the bars. It's going forever and over the elements. And the elements of the 16th notes in the left hand combined with the 8th notes of the walking inner voices, they are constantly flowing like as if the singer wants to hold the flow of this river of emotion. My imagination runs wild when I describe music, doesn't it? I know it's silly. But that's how it comes out intuitively and sometimes too spontaneously for me. As if the melody really seizes the emotional flow of the river. And these 16th notes in the left hand are written by a group of 4 like in any Bach piece. You know. Figurative patterns, but nevertheless emotional build-up of hairpin with a cacciatura or port de voix, the appoggiatura from under. It's complex and at the same time whispered in terms of the many elements of the accompaniment in order to have the melody fly and flow over like a bird in the sky. as if the time zone of the singer is completely in a different dimension compared to the 16th notes. Oops, that was a wrong note. At my age, what a shame. And you get to the point where you think, if the melodic line is so stretched, if the 16th notes are so rich of inner voices, in a way they are distracting from the melody, especially because of its decay. It's not like... Of course it's anti-singing, even if it prevents the decay. Or then on paper you can say these are the vibrato of sustaining harmonically the decay of the melodic note. He could have written it in quarters rather than half notes. You'll have less decay than to stretch it in half notes, obliging you to play even more the accompaniment subtly under the escapement. Well, he doesn't say that either, right? I make him say that in the voicing of the secondary voice, which is to say, nobody will hear it anyway. Compared to... or perhaps none. And then the listener picks up. But I like the subjectivity of bringing out what I want to bring out on it. After all, it's my moment. A little bit of chromaticism down is a decay. Because all this chromaticism in the accompaniment is rising. The melody drops melodically. And this flat 7-1 is amazing. He has so many chances to do the leading tone when he does the deceptive cadence. And finally, he doesn't do the E sharp at the moment of the leading tone to go to the tonic. So it stays very tonal, and the fourth beat is modal. His choice, our color or highlight. Because it helps to take the 16th notes in the right hand to liberate the voice leading in the bass, because now the two hands are so close. But he's written it so the melody is played with a single right hand, and all the secondary voices, 3 of them, the single left hand in the notation, but it could be readjusted, redistributed. And the aria becomes a dialogue between a soprano and a tenor or baritone. Well, he doesn't say accelerando, even if you feel that burst of build up, so perhaps I should avoid, at least avoid indulging. closer to the famous climax. We're no more in half notes, we're in quarter notes, shorter breath, more emotion, more hug, more tight hug. Definitely at the moment of climax, the left hand is two hands. Such a rich inner voice, such moving, emotional, intense inner voice compared to the main voice. Between the hinted, the suggested, the published or the notated, the intended for the through the notation or for the interpretation, held back or open to the other. So hold back and then only show some to the others. The idea of choices of the soundscape for the depth and the three-dimensionality of it compared to the resonances and the combination of moving parts and flowing parts and secondary parts. You have 16th, 8th notes, half notes, whole notes. You have different layers of pulses, almost different ages at the same time superimposed, that give you that sense of flow at the same time of being in some kind of a seized moment where it's all idle. It's just a combination of both worlds of emotional intensity brooding inside and emotionally, lyrically displaying some kind of a absolutely unstoppable melodic line that is almost detached from the accompaniment, which has too many inner voices for itself. And how do you manage that in terms of defining how to build up the excitement and how to not drop too early the descent after it? And if you bring out secondary voices or third voices, I think you have to love it and you respond to it. And since it's so rich in its texture and so beautifully simple in its emotional melody, you struggle finding the right balance between rubato, build up, crescendo, not too early, not too right away, with accelerando, but not too early, not much, going from aria to duo, and then, yeah. It's like an emotional roller coaster journey in a very short piece, because what it is. And it has to be heard one time through when you perform it or when you listen to it. When we start, as I did, sections over and over, you end up by losing their the perspective with their own structural place in the piece in terms of that's when the details become more meaningful than they really are in the flow of the events. What a hug, isn't it? What a musical hug.